David, whenever you're,
Yep.
yep. And then let me know when you want me to stop sharing the slide.
I think what we'll do, good morning to those of you that are logging in. We will wait till 1 minute past the top of the hour, and then we'll get started officially because we have some great speakers. We have my dog barking in the background. And we've got an awesome presentation I'm looking very forward to, and I want to make sure we maximize every minute that we have. So I'm going to wait till 1 minute past the top of the hour, and then we'll get straight to introductions.
Good for David.
Yeah.
So Jerry, that question was because you must have been in the room with me when we voted on sled hockey becoming an official sport for in Lillehammer. You must have been in the room with me when we voted on that in Northampton, 1993.
No, that wouldn't have been me.
He's not taking any credit for it anyways, or blame.
Okay.
Just a minute, I'll run downstairs and have a look at my 1 or 2 files.
Oh, no, don't worry about it. We'll fake it.
That's right. The end result was good anyhow.
Yeah. I just wanted to be sure you were lurking as a witness to my story that's soon to come.
Whatever we did, it worked.
That's true.
Eli, I'll get you to take the slide down now, and we'll get to our presentation here. Good morning, everyone. I can see that we've got a number of attendees that are just starting to log in now. We did have 75 people RSVP, so we're excited about getting a good audience today. Welcome to, I think it's our 7th, if I'm correct, Steadward Talks. Eli, Ted, and a woman by the name of Mary Hooms, who's a professor at the University of Louisville, and I kind of started this conversation with Dr. Steadward about 2 years ago. And really our purpose was, I'd say twofold, if not threefold. Number one, it was an acknowledgement that there was an opportunity to perhaps go deep into some histories of specific sports or specific items within the Paralympic movement. And we would have argued that many of these had not been lost, but perhaps weren't documented officially, or were in kind of sporadic files and people's memories. And so we wanted to have an opportunity to kind of dive deep into a number of topics and areas within the Paralympic movement that we thought were, just great stories and interesting, and were worth sharing and worth preserving. And so our first one was with Dr. Steadward, where as the founding president of the International Paralympic Committee, he talked about some of those founding years and kind of the mid-1980s and the official creation of the organization in 1989. Since then, we've delved into topic areas such as inclusion in the Commonwealth Games, and we've also looked at specific sports. And so most recently, we looked at sitting volleyball. Today, we're going to talk about para ice hockey, sled hockey, sledge hockey. It's known by a number of different names. And we've got some outstanding commentators, amateur historians, and people involved in the sport and the movement. They're going to spend some time taking us from its earliest beginnings right to the present day. So I'm going to very quickly introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to provide them as much opportunity as possible to talk about their experiences and their lived experiences with para ice hockey, sledge hockey, sled hockey. I feel like I have to say them all. And then we're going to hopefully set aside about 20 minutes at the end using the chat function, which should be on the right-hand side of your Zoom webinar, to really engage in some conversations, particularly with the idea of moving forward. The other aspect that we've always tried to include within our conversations is this idea of inclusion. And where it fits both within the disability community and outside of the disability community. So we're hoping that that can be part of our conversations towards the end of today's webinar. So without further ado, our speakers include Annie and Jerry Johnston. It'll be Annie that will be the primary speaker, and Jerry may certainly chime in. I'm not gonna tell him he can't. That's for sure. And Annie Johnston's got a fantastic connection to the sport of sled hockey through her sister, and who has since passed away. And she's going to tell a little bit about that opportunity where she came back. Well, Jerry came back. I shouldn't be the one telling the story, but it's about the origins of the sled itself. And so, Annie, I'll in a minute, I'm going to ask you to speak, but let me just do the introductions of our other speakers first, and then I'll come back to you. Our second and third speaker then are going to work interchangeably, and one is Manny, who's a sled hockey player from Team USA, and he's presently based in Minnesota. And I should have said earlier that Annie and Jerry are based in Kimberley, British Columbia, which is kind of in the interior of BC. Excuse me. And Manny is going to work kind of conjointly with Ted Fay. Ted's a former professor, a retired professor from the State University of New York in Cortland, and is now living, or has been living since then, in Amherst, Massachusetts. And Ted and I go way back to the 90s as it relates to kind of disability and inclusion and those sorts of things. And so Ted was involved with the kind of the organizing of the earliest days of sled hockey, para ice hockey, and Manny as a player is then going to speak to kind of that era in the 90s and the 2000s. And then Tara Chisholm is going to finish up, and Tara's the head coach of the women's para ice hockey team in Canada, and she actually lives in Medicine Hat, which will come back into the story. And Medicine Hat's a small town in the eastern part of the province of Alberta, which is also where I'm based, just outside of Calgary. And it's Medicine Hat, actually, which had the earliest kind of connection to sled hockey, and Annie's going to speak a little bit about that. So it's kind of interesting that we come full circle. And then, as always, we're going to finish with Dr. Robert Steadward, who was my advisor during my PhD at the University of Alberta, which he says is his crowning achievement, and his greatest professional moment was being my supervisor for my PhD. I can certainly understand that. And he's going to provide concluding thoughts and try to summarize all of our conversation as it relates to sled hockey. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Annie Johnston, who has been involved in disability sport for close to 60 years. Is that a fair comment? Annie, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I'm going to pass it over to you. I want you to walk us through those earliest days of your sister's involvement in Jerry bringing the sled back from Scandinavia.
Hi there. Pardon me. Always happens, doesn't it? In 1979, Jerry went to an ISOD meeting, and ISOD is the International Sports Organization for the Disabled in Norway as an advisor. And he went with Dick Loisel, and the Swedes said they wanted Canada to start sled hockey because they were tired of playing just Norway. And so they gave the sled to Dick, and Dick said, "I don't think we want it," to Jerry. And then Jerry got home. He didn't say he was no in Norway. So when he got home, phoned the board, and they said, "Geez, we really don't want to have another sport."
No,
So
Annie, if I can just get you to explain why Jerry was there and Jerry's involvement, and insofar as the example of another sport.
Jerry was at the ISOD meeting as an advisor for alpine skiing. And as it turned out, he was the only ski instructor coach on the board. And he found himself saying at one point, he was only going to be an advisor and he wasn't going to say anything. And then he said, "I heard this voice and it said, 'Christ, you can't do it that way.'" And they put him on the board, and he was on the board as a chairman for 10 years. Then Jack Benedict came on as president or chairman, and for 10 years, but Jerry was with him. So it goes back a long time. And anyway, when the group said they didn't want it, Jerry looked at me and he said, "What the hell are we going to do with this sled?" And I said, "Well, why don't you phone Jean?" And Jean is my late twin sister. And because she's a mom, a hockey mom, and she was the secretary of the Medicine Hat minor hockey. So we phoned her and she said, oh, what a good idea. Yeah, I'll try. So she did. And she enters Jean Lane in my notes here. I can still remember it was the spring of 1980 when Jean went to ask Dawn of Blue, oh, I'm awful. Where are we? Blue Imp playground equipment, if he could make some sleds. And he said, oh, what's sled hockey? So she told him, oh, that's a good idea. Well, who's going to pay for it? I don't know yet. Okay. He said, well, give me a couple of days and I'll see what I can do, how I can make out. Now, this sled at that point, the old beat up yellow sled that we got from the Swedes, it weighed 30 pounds. So guys on sleds nowadays, I think it's 6 pounds or something. So, but anyway, Jean says, I'm sure we can get sponsors for the sleds. So that's okay. So then, oh, I'm sorry. So Jeannie, being Jean, she left, gave him a great big hug and said, I'll be back. Then in the summer, it was summertime by this time, and Jean asked if we would go down to Medicine Hat and be in the Medicine Hat Stampede Parade, and to bring Myrtle with us. And we had Myrtle, and she was a one-legged mannequin that we used to use as demonstration and without riggers. So we took her down and we put her on the sled or on the float and the sled, and we had a great time. And it was a wonderful day, and it was hot, but it was just wonderful. And the theme of the day was, you don't need legs to play hockey. And we got lots of people coming back to us after I got off the parade route. And we figured that we were really pretty smart because we had skiing and sledge hockey. And nobody knew what sledge hockey was. Anyway, the next step was to get somebody to help her talk parents into allowing them to try the sleds. Because that's the trouble we had as skiing in the beginning, was parents didn't want to put them in danger. Well, it's like any sport. You start at the bottom, you don't start at the top. And so they took it. And they wondered what they could do. And so Jeannie has a very dear friend at the time. And she needed her to be Jean's brains. Jean had the enthusiasm, but she didn't have the organizational skills that Ruthie had. But anyway, Ruthie had a very disabled son, and she worked with the disabled, so she was ready, and thought it was a great thing to do. Anyway, she did it. Jeannie thought, well, now we've got the kids, but where are we going to put them? So Jean went down to see the late John Bockstein, and who was the head of the recreation department in Medicine Hat. And fortunately, had put an ad in the paper that stating that there were approximately $43,000 available for sports for the disabled, but was concerned because the rules were that the project had to be new, unique, and for the disabled, and had no idea how he was going to fill out the rules to get the money into Medicine Hat to celebrate the 1981 International Sports or International Year of the Disabled. enters Jean Lane with a great big smile on her face. She asked Bockstein about getting ice time at the arena for sledge hockey. He said, "What is sledge hockey?" She told him. But she made it quite clear that she wasn't looking for more ice time. She was looking for equal time, but for the disabled. She wanted 2 ice times, one for ice picking, and she explained that, which was just skating around the ice with no puck. After all, not all disabled people want to play hockey and sport, and some just want to skate around the rink. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of kids who wanted to skate around the rink, and therefore it didn't last that many years. John Bockstein looked at Jean and said, "Who is going to pay for the ice time?" Jean smiled and she said, "You are." He laughed
Don't beat around the bush.
and said, "And why? And does it meet all the rules to get the money?" She said, "Of course it meets all the rules." She said, "Of course it does." She walked out of the office with a paid ice time at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning, Saturday mornings, and I think it was about 5 o'clock on Wednesdays after school. I also think Jean got Bockstein to pay for the Blue Imp sledges. It was July 1981 that Jean and her husband, Don Lane, 2 of her sons, plus several disabled kids, some parents and friends, for a total of 26, hired a bus and filled it with sleds and sticks. And of course, Jean's friend, who was her extra arm, also got on the bus, as she had done all the organization of the trip, for including the scheduling of demonstrations and accommodations, etc., etc. For 3 weeks, they were on the bus. Can you imagine? There were also demonstrations in Minnesota, Ted and Manny, and in the US. They had kids demonstrations demonstrating how to use the sleds. And Jean's youngest son, David, hi David, at the time was about 12, was the designated goalie across Canada and loved it. He wasn't disabled, he just loved helping his mom out. They gave demonstrations on ice if arenas had ice, and if not, well, they used a park for the slope. So the sleds would slide down, but if no slope available, they just slid across the flats. They allowed kids, lots of kids, to try out the sleds and had lots of help of pictures of the Medicine Hat kids on the bus or on the ice. The deal was, with the help of John Richardson of amateur fitness and amateur sports branch of in Ottawa, each province in Canada was given 6 sleds. And if the group bought 6 sleds, except for Ontario and Quebec, due to the bigger populations, were given 12 sleds if the group bought 12 sleds. Danny McDonald took center ice in one of Jean's presentations in Medicine Hat in 1980.
And I think Dave has actually posted a picture of that in the chat.
Oh, did he? Oh, good for him. And one of his comments was, "Geez, it's easier to stand up to play hockey than sitting in a sled, but it was fun." And that's the very, very, very beginning of sledge hockey in Canada.
Annie, before I pass it over to Ted, where'd the name come from, sled? I've heard rumors, and I don't know if this is true or not. Maybe some of the other people on the call know this, that it was supposed to be called sled hockey, but it was a mispronunciation of sled because of a Scandinavian accent that it became Sledge. But I don't know if that's true or not. Is that an urban legend, or is there any?
I have
Probably
more than likely.
something lost in the translation, but the action's still there.
Yeah, I don't know. I had never even thought about that before, but that's
I might have made that story up myself. I'm known to do that, but
No,
Yes,
you didn't. Actually, from at least my entry into all this was in Yilo in 1980 with the U.S. cross country team, which was an all blind visually impaired team at that time. That's another story for another time, but how the U.S. entered this picture. But what I recall is not only ice picking, which was basically speed skating version of sitting, sitting speed skating version, and ice sledge hockey. It was sledge, coming out of the Norwegian mouths, I can tell you. There wasn't, I don't think it was lost in translation. It was just their concept of, a sleigh, as we would say it, a flexible flyer, if you will, for kids. So it became more of a sledge.
Yeah. All right.
Well,
Well, Annie,
given its weight, it sure was a sledge.
Sledge.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
So Annie, I really enjoyed your story, and this idea of you taking Dave across to Peggy's Cove, Nova Scotia, so clear across the country, and back.
Yes. I wasn't there. I was building this house.
Your sister, running these clinics and dipping down into Minnesota. And in a minute, we're going to get to Manny, who's living in Minnesota right now, and is had played on the U.S. team. But Ted, I want you to pick up the story a little bit now, kind of from your perspective. So we've talked about this, trip across, Canada and kind of the northern parts of the United States, kind of introducing people to sledge, para ice hockey, whatever it was called.
Well, correspondingly, my dear friend Tor Kleppa, who's now passed, was doing that globally. He was basically doing demos and exhibitions all over the world. I don't know who was paying for it, maybe the Norwegian government, but the fact was even though, I guess we can say history tells us that this really emanated in Stockholm or in Sweden first, it was really the Norwegians that pushed the envelope, I think, in terms of trying to look at this becoming, being included in this sort of winter sport menu. And so in the middle 80s, so Yilo was the 1980 second Paralympic Winter Games, Innsbruck 84, 88. And by 88, there was a demonstration event of both ice picking. Actually, I think it was a medal event in 88, if I recall correctly, but the hockey tournament was just a, demonstration. Take that forward, because I became ISOD Nordic section chief in 88, and I remember in a number of meetings, particularly a memorable one in Israel in 1989, this was brought forward from an ISOD perspective and eventually an IPC perspective that we needed more sports, irrespective of what the thought was, is we have to alpine skiing and Nordic skiing. We needed more sports in the winter menu of the Winter Games. And so one was ice picking, speed skating, which was not adopted by very many nations. Japan and Norway were the most dominant one, as you could see that from the medal table in 1998 in Nagano. But back to sled hockey. So yours truly, I would say I'm more a hockey fan, but a hockey advocate. And even though in my role as a cross-country ski person, I could see that there needed to be a push along with the Norwegians. And so added voices to this, push to see this tournament perhaps in as early as 92, but more likely 94. And I'll cut to the chase. So there was a memorable first IPC Sport Council meeting. We were there, it seems like, for months. We were probably there for days in Northampton, England. 1993, we brought this forward as a Sport Council group to vote on. Not many people in the room were that familiar with winter sport, let alone sled hockey. And so it took a few of us to become rather passionate and suddenly put our own agenda aside of the sports we represented and push for this. And this is where it becomes, I think, a really fascinating urban legend, which is not an urban legend at all. It was going to be a close vote. As I recall, it passed by 1 vote. And the argument was it didn't meet the rules. The new IPC rules was you had to have at least 6 nations, at least 6 nations. And we had 6 nations. The problem was 1 nation was not in good standing with the host country. So this would be the USA, shout out to Manny in a minute, and Norway. Now, what was the problem? The problem was an unpaid hotel bill at the 1993 World Sled Hockey Tournament in Oslo. And the Norwegians were not going to budge on this until that either the bill was paid or they were not coming. They were not going to be invited. So my memory was that we were ruminating around about this. Well, how could we have a 5-nation tournament? It's against the rules. We're just starting as an IPC. We have to show we have, we believe in the rules we've just created. So I said, well, let's invite them and then suspend them. And that's what we did. We invited, initially, there was a 6-team tournament with the USA coming in, but we suspended them, not unlike the Russian, Federation was suspended from Rio in Pyeongchang, over blood doping. We did it over a hotel bill.
So the entire history of para ice hockey was perhaps completely thwarted because of an unpaid hotel bill from 1993.
It was that close. It was a very impassioned discussion because we weren't getting much help from our summer, Paralympic sport folks. They didn't really care. But as winter sport folks, as Dr. Steadward has said, we always, moved to a beat of a different drummer anyway. And we said, screw that. We just need this sport desperately. And so that's the story. The rest moves on to, Manny's team was, I think, Manny, you mentioned, and you can talk about this, you were in attendance as an observer.
I was.
In 94.
Let's just kind of connect the dots here, though. So Annie talked about, this cross country, and then you made reference to your friend from Norway who had internationally gone around. So at this point in time, there were about 6 countries participating in sledge hockey. This is in kind of the early 90s. So it would have been Norway, Sweden, Canada, the United States. And what were
Great Britain and Estonia, which had just regained its sovereignty from the devolution of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
So Estonia was actually the 6th nation.
So it had obviously hosted world championships in para ice hockey, although it would have been called sledge hockey at the time. And then the U.S. had been suspended. So this is not what 93 you're talking about?
Well, 94, the Lillehammer Games.
So the
which was actually technically the first IPC Winter Games, because Barcelona was the first games. They were in summer, but we actually took over. I was the Nordic section chief at that time. We took over responsibility as from an IPC governance in 94.
The 94 was the first time that sledge hockey was in a Paralympic Games.
Correct.
Was it a demonstration sport?
No, it was a medal event, and it went down to the gold medal final. Was again the 2 great rivals that don't like each other, Sweden and Norway. It was an epic battle, and I think it showed that this was going to accelerate. It mattered. A number of us were sort of, doing our forecasting and what this was going to look like in approximately 10 years.
Yeah. So Manny, let's pick that up from there. So when did you start playing sledge hockey?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say that talk about making an impression on the international scene is being accepted and then suspended. But needless to say, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. So Annie, first of all, Annie, I want to say thank you for the efforts of you and the people around you and your organizations that supported the sport. If it wasn't for you and the rest of the folks, it wouldn't have trickled down through Minnesota. So back in 1990, the sport took in Minnesota. The first club in the U.S., the Minnesota North Stars, came into fruition. It was spearheaded by who I consider, I think everybody considers the pioneer of sled hockey in the U.S., John Schatzline. Ironically, coincidentally, I just happened to run into him at a local rehab institute called Sister Kenny. I was there getting treated for my post-polio treatment, and I just happened to be wheeling by his office, and he was watching a video of sled hockey on a VHS tape, and I just got sucked in. So that's how I started. That's how I met John. Just ran into his office, didn't even look at him. I was like, I want to do that. So to Ted's point, the sleds at that point were very heavy. And let me backtrack 1 year. I ran into John in '91. So the club had already been in existence 1 year. They had already gone up to Ottawa, Canada, and participate in some of the tournaments. So immediately, he introduced me to the sport, to the equipment. Sleds were very heavy. We didn't use a traditional ice system that we use or skate system that we use today. They were literally boots off the bottom of an ice, able-bodied hockey, ice hockey skates. And so you can imagine that the blades didn't necessarily work true. They sometimes toe in, toe out. So you can imagine the mess, right? But our first mission, not only to participate in the sport, was to get the word out. And so we did exactly what Annie Johnston and the folks up there in Canada did: is how can we get the word out? Where do we go do clinics? And we went all over the country. Through the early 90s, we were down in Texas, we were in Massachusetts, and we started planting seeds, and eventually throughout the early 90s, clubs started popping up, primarily in Massachusetts. Besides Minnesota, we had folks in Wisconsin. So we realized two things. We got to get the word out, and to Ted's point, and Annie, and the international scene is, how do we develop a program that can represent the U.S. properly? So the 90s was an evolution of how to get the sport out, how to make the equipment better. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the equipment, if I could. Just take a minute. Everybody knows what these are. This is a composite stick, but back in the early 90s, these were made out of ash wood, right? So you can see the evolution of the sport. Eventually grew to composite shafts and composite inserts, made them lighter. The pick design, evolved as well, and it's probably even different today, right? But this, to me, was kind of a signal of where what direction the sport was going. The other thing I did is being a goaltender. That's the position I gravitated because you didn't have to move as much. So one of my counterparts, Paul Rosen, gave me actually 3 pairs of these. It's basically a TPS stick made by Louisville. It's a miniature goalie stick, if you want to call it that. And I took this stick, and I love the design that it provided, but there were some issues with this design. It has a pick on the end, just like all the other sticks. Well, they used to take this pick right here and put it right at this elbow, sticking down. And this would give the goalie a pivot point, right, to either go forward and back, So in other words, he would put it down this way to go forward, and he would use this pick residing here to go backwards or pivot or turn. So what I did is I came up with a design. It's basically a half moon pick, and they call it the Guerra pick today, I think. But I think everybody uses this today. And this allows me to kind of pivot the stick and move it around and still make contact with the ice. So that was the first thing I changed. The next thing I changed is when introduced to the glove, people used to take all kinds of metal contraptions and put them in the outside, bolts, ice fishing, boot grips, whatever you call it. So it took me 10 years to perfect it. But what I did is I took a track shoe, I chopped it up, and I sewed it onto the outside of the glove. And then I was able to insert track shoe picks into each one of these holes and then grab the ice that way. It was light, it wasn't heavy, and it didn't fill up with snow during game. And I think today, people still do that. I know the evolution of that glove that you saw when I was in 2006, my last Winter Paralympic Games. Nike actually put them inside the glove, so you couldn't even see the track shoe pieces. You would just see the little holes. The last thing I want to talk about is this. Everybody who skated in the olden times knows what this is. This is a Swedish skate system that came out, I don't know, probably early 90s. And you can see how far apart they are, 3.5 inches, give or take. So what I did is, being a goalie and needing lateral movement, back in, it had to be the early 90s, I started looking at fake ice. and synthetic ice. And I started looking at a way that I could combine both so that I could have that lateral movement. So I came up with a system in the early 90s that combined this with this. And so if you look at the bottom of this, I started tinkering and started saying, hey, what if I make a blade out of synthetic ice and attach it, within each side of this channel, and then take this blade and put it on the outside and combine the best of both worlds. So this took me 10 years to figure out. And even in 1998, I had it. I didn't use it though, because I wasn't comfortable enough with it. Didn't know how it would perform on the international scene. I did use it in Salt Lake City in 2002, and everybody knows what happened there.
Oh, the secret sauce. Now it comes out.
The secret sauce. But back to the sport itself, along with the evolution of getting as many club teams as possible created, increasing the athlete base, right? Because you need a good athlete base to have a good national team. To Ted's point, in 93, even though I was there in 94, we weren't ready to represent the U.S. yet. So I look at that as a blessing in disguise. Along came 1998. We refer to them as the 98ers. They were truly the pioneers to kind of set the tone and the table and the possibility of what the U.S. program could be like. 4 years later, we went through some turmoil between 1998 and 2002. Our coaching wasn't right. Our athlete base, though it was increasing, and though we had probably the most clubs ever in the U.S., it didn't feel right. The vibe wasn't right. So in 2001, we actually came across Rick Middleton, a Canadian. Well, I transplanted U.S. citizen now, but Rick actually set the tone for our program just the year before, in 2001, before Salt Lake. And there's a couple things that we did as a national team program to correct and right-size what was wrong. Rick was one, obviously, in his methodology and his philosophy on how to play ice hockey, combined with our athletes, was a perfect match. I would argue that the second thing that we did, and this was kind of also part of the secret sauce, Ted, we went from this to this. And you can see that just that 3.5 inches to 2 inches, maybe 1.5 inches, really set the game apart and put it on a whole other level. The equipment had changed slightly. Yes, the sleds were lighter. The picks were a little better, but everything was pretty much still a standard design. But this, to me, was why we won a gold medal, right? There were athletes that were doing this, tinkering with this design for a long time, but to do it holistically as a team, it was night and day. And you can look at the video in 2002, and you can see the maneuverability difference between our athletes and the rest of the countries. Not to take away from any of the veterans, right, at that time. They were incredible, gifted athletes. But you could literally see in the video that the turning radiuses were tighter. Everything about maneuvering was more aggressive. And so you combined Rick, you combine our new, our athlete base and the evolution of the equipment to get it to that point. That truly set the tone, and we were successful in 2002 and winning a gold medal. And I think everybody took notice in a lot of different ways. 2002 set the tone for a lot of different things, internationally, equipment, marketing, I mean, you name it. So to me, that was a pivotal point in my career. And I mean, I can go on and on and on, but at the end of the day, what I get a big pride and joy, and I feel like a proud papa, is when you look at where the sport is today. You look at the number of clubs within USA Hockey, right? And you look at the TV viewership during the Winter Paralympics, and you look at sled hockey being one of those flagship programs.
Hang on a second, Ted, because Manny, what I want you to do is now, so Canada obviously learned very quickly after 2002 because Canada won the gold medal in Turin in 2006. And I think everybody knows that. But
the only gold medal you've won, by the way, in Paralympic history. I'm just saying.
And
I do want to point out, we should have been in that game if it wasn't for a lousy call, a penalty shot call. And Ted, I don't know if you were there. Were you there?
Yeah, I was there.
Okay. I had the first, so I'm just gonna set the record straight. So I have a breakaway on me, right? He's coming. I can't remember who it was, but our defenseman catches up to him, puts his shoulder on him, starts riding him off the hash marks. The Norwegian player takes his hand and tucks it under his shoulder and pulls him over on top of himself. And the Swedish ref is like 30 feet behind, and he calls the penalty shot. And that was it. We could have been in the gold medal game again.
Yeah, there were a few calls, but I just want to make two quick points. Number one was observing, being in the hall, watching the first tournament in '94, and seeing the real disparity in terms of athleticism. It was a slow game, generally speaking, with occasional sort of bursts of wow. And that was because of the athlete who was handling the puck at that time. It was actually a Swedish a double above knee amputee that was like, whoa, okay, this guy maneuvers differently than anybody else out there. And he was lighter, quicker, faster, and he was clearly dominating. But it wasn't an even sort of ice sheet in terms of ability and skill. You fast forward to 2002, and by that time, there was a lot more speed, a lot more athleticism. And a very simple thing is, in terms of, you talked about the sticks before, going from ash to composite, the puck was basically played on the ice. It never got elevated more than 1 or 2 inches, or maybe, you as a goalie would know this better, Manny, but the fact is you were facing pucks over your shoulders coming later, as you moved on towards 2002 than the early days. The early days, the puck seemed to never get elevated to speak of.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would say the puck speed got faster. I mean, don't get me wrong. In the early '90s, guys, there was guys that could do whatever they wanted, but overall, I would say that the puck got faster, harder to stop. Through the mid '90s, leading up to to where it is today.
Better flow and all that.
Ed, I want to make sure we get Tara some time and time for questions too.
2 points. One is the 2002 tournament set records in terms of crowds, in terms of interest, and really launched things forward in that way. And the other point I'll make, and then I'll shut up here, is that in 2014 in Sochi, is the NBC, from a US standpoint, NBC finally got in the game in terms of broadcasting Paralympic Winter Games, and then consequently Summer Games. But it was the gold medal game between Russia and the US. The NBC decided to move that from cable, it's NBCSN, to broadcast, to network at 2:00 in the afternoon, prime time on a Saturday. And that itself also, not maybe, because of the level of ability and the dynamic let's say, presence of the game had so transformed.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
And arguably, I even think Vladimir Putin was at that game. I think there was Russia and the US that were in the gold medal finals.
Yep.
Broadcast live by NBC on a Saturday afternoon. And
Big deal.
It was elevated.
Yep. And you also had tensions internationally. So it played into that whole old scheme of the big red machine of, the Soviet Union, and then consequently Russia producing so many hockey players and great teams. It placed itself in that narrative.
So Tara, I want to get to you now, talking about kind of the current status of sledge hockey, and in particular, your role as the head coach of the women's sledge team, or para ice hockey team. I still have a hard time saying para ice hockey.
Okay, yeah, it takes a little bit to transition over to para ice hockey. Yeah, and I want to thank you for letting me be here today. I know that the women's movement hasn't had a lot of representation in the history thus far, and that's what we're looking to change. So yeah, as of today, there's only been 2 women that have played in the Paralympic Games. In 1994, a Norwegian goaltender, and then in 2018, as most people know, Lena Schroeder, also from Norway, was a woman who played in the Paralympic Games. So we don't have very much representation when it comes to women playing, but it's not to say that there are not women playing. So some of you will know this history much better than I do, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but in those 2006 games in Turin, there was a Swedish woman that was looking to roster for that team, and they were denied placement to have her on that roster entering into Sweden. So they did take a look at this coming into 2010 in Vancouver in Canada. and they changed the rules. So they allowed for men's teams to be up to 15 players if it was just all men. And then if you were to have a mixed team, a mixed gender team, so men and women, you could have 16 players come and roster. So you had to have at least one woman in order to have 16 players. So that was the rule that changed. It's since progressed, so now we have slightly higher numbers, so 17 for a men's team. Mixed gender team would be 18 that you're allowed to bring to the Paralympic Games. So it is considered a mixed gender sport, but as we all know, we haven't seen a lot of women come through. So how the women's movement started was actually by Canada and USA. So in 2006, when they heard that women were denied access into the Paralympic Games, some local people within Ottawa region and down in the United States decided that they're going to start their own women's only teams, that this was something that they wanted to rectify. So in 2007, in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, this was the first ever all-female para ice hockey game that was played. And it was between Canada and the USA. I have some players on my team still that played in that game. One of my players actually said that the USA did not have enough players to bring up. So she actually had a USA jersey on for the first ever Canada versus USA game, so that there was enough to go around. So she laughs about that now. That's Peggy Asink, who is one of my assistant captains of my national team. So we were making it happen, even if you had to become an American for a hockey game, which is quite laughable now, because we obviously have quite the rivalry against them now, and a great respect for that country. But yeah, we were willing to do anything. And then fast forward a few years, I became involved in 2013. I had been coaching grassroots sledge hockey in Edmonton, Alberta, with the Paralympic Sports Association, which I won't go into about the history of the Paralympic Sports Association because it's grassroots. Anyways, I'll leave that for David for another day to explain. But yeah, so I got involved with the team in 2013, and Sandy and Keith Metzger were the original founders of the women's team here in Canada. And in 2014 is when the IPC worked with us as Team Canada, Team USA, and there was a collective Team Europe. So women mostly from Scandinavian countries, Nordic region, that came together to form Team Europe. And they came over to Canada, to Brampton, Ontario, Canada. And we held the first ever Women's International World Cup. So it was not a world championship, it was a World Cup. So we held that in 2014. The USA did end up winning that. I am not too proud to say that. You have to say what history occurred. And then in 2018 in Ostrava, Norway, we held another World Cup. This one was unique. We still had Team Canada, Team USA, Team Europe, but then we also had a development competition of 3-on-3 with developing nations. So I have my list here because we had quite a few women representing. So we had Australia, Croatia, Czech Republic, we had women from England and Scotland, Finland, France, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. So we had quite a number of women come and travel to Ostrava. We did clinics there. We worked with coaches. We did some classification pieces there, just growing the game. And then, as you know, later that year in 2018, we had Lena participate with Team Norway with the mixed gender team, she being the only woman. So she was one out of the 135 players that were in Pyeongchang in 2018. And then going forward, so women have been a part of the World Para Ice Hockey strategic plan in the past. World Para Ice Hockey just released their strategic plan just during the pandemic or just before it happened here. And one of the target areas under development for the 20 to 2022 strategic plan is to advance female participation in the sport. So that's kind of the future, is to look at getting more of those nations that I had listed developed, and even more beyond that, because we know, I think Anton's here today from Russia. He's got young girls playing in Russia that I know about. And then we've got women that are playing in South Korea and Japan also. So yeah, it's an exciting future, but we've got a lot of work to do.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara.
You're welcome.
We've got just a little bit over, I'm going to say 6 or 7 minutes, because I do want to give Dr. Steadward a chance to kind of have the final word at today's sessions. And I've really enjoyed this. And it's fascinating to think about the growth from, Annie's sister, Jean, touring the sleds across Canada into Minnesota, in the early 80s to where it is right now. And Tara just going through the list of nations, including Australia, for crying out loud, where, para ice hockey is taking place in women's. Now, again, I know the U.S. won the gold medal against Canada in the Games in 2018 in Pyeongchang. How many nations are participating right now on the men's side? Or I guess officially the mixed side. But as Tara made reference to, it is predominantly male-centric. How many teams are competing internationally now in para ice hockey? Do we know?
I don't know. Let me Google that.
Well, I'm sure we have Marshall from Hockey Canada on. He might know, or I think Michelle from World Para Ice Hockey might be on the call too. So, but we have.
My point is, it's grown, and it's grown significantly. Yeah. And I actually, you mentioned Marshall. I want to get to, so in throughout all of this, certainly in North American context, Hockey Canada is now responsible for para ice hockey. Certainly on the national team, for the men's side, again, predominantly men's side. And I know with the U.S., with the recent
it's
the U.S.
Hockey.
OPC, did I get that right?
It's actually USA Hockey, which you have parallel national federations in each country, which is an important point in terms of the evolution of governance of within nation of hockey per se. Para hockey being part of the portfolio of those federations.
The question I want to get to, and it's Marshall's initially, and then I saw your question too, Abby, who's a PhD student at Virginia. So Marshall asked the question, like how do we take the next steps now in growing this game globally? And so again, from the earliest days of carting around a 30-pound sled, Ted was talking about, 6 nations only really participating in kind of the early 90s. And now here we are, I'm going to guess probably 30 to 40 nations internationally.
I think if I could jump in, sorry, Dave, I think and I don't know if this is a true statement or not, but in my opinion, I think what's happened is from the early 90s, right, until today, inclusion has kind of gone by the wayside, right? To Ted's point, right? Some of the best skaters in the history of sled hockey have been double amps, right? Jan Edbom, for example, was Superman back in the day. You could counter and say that that's not necessarily true with Sly Sylvester, right? Out of Chicago, he was not an amputee. But I think what's happened over time is that different countries have argued that we need a point system, right? Because we will never compete with the larger country demographics, i.e. Canada and the US. You look at the sport today, it's top heavy. Just like the women's national able-bodied program, it's US, Canada, and maybe Sweden, and then everybody else drops off the face of the map. Today's the same thing. You have the US and Canada, and literally everybody drops off the face of the earth as far as skill set wise. So I don't know what the perfect answer is, but I think potentially some countries may be looking at this and looking at the roster, looking at the pictures and saying, where are we going to find, 15, 17 amputees, right? And then you have the internal strife for the internal battle. We don't want to do that because it doesn't really represent what our disabled sports or governing body mission is, which is inclusion, right? So the question is, how do is it time to develop a point system for further inclusion? And if so, how do you develop that? What's a fair balance to keep that speed, to keep that, that edge that sled hockey has right now over other sports from a point system
There's a couple questions come in specific to women's hockey, Tara, and I'm hoping you can answer some of them. So, Abby asked the question about, do on a officially mixed gender team, is there a specific number of minutes that a player, that's female have to play in order for it to be official? And, the other questions too, I think, are looking forward as far as if there will be women's para ice hockey in future games. So, the example being 2026 where it returns to Italy. Are you familiar with any of those discussions?
I'm familiar with some of the discussions, yeah. So I would say that, our biggest goal right now is to get more countries playing and established. We have to have that first before we have the possibility of being in the Paralympic Games. And part of that pathway is to have an official world championship. So that's something that we have not had yet. We've had World Cups, but we have not had a world championship. So before the pandemic happened, we had some dates set to look towards having a world championship. Those might get adjusted slightly, but our goal is to just have those still 2 to 3 years away to have a world championship. So whether that means 2026 or not for the Paralympics, I think that'll be depending on how quickly we can grow the sport during this time. So there's a little bit of work to do there to push it forward.
So I have a question, Tara. It's quite familiar in terms of the arguments and discussions with wheelchair basketball that at least stateside that, the Canadian model where at least grassroots, you're actually not trying to limit who gets in this case on a sled, which brings the question is, could the potentially women's game get accelerated in terms of adoption, expansion, if you allowed able-bodied athletes to play? And you could limit the number, but by adding the population, then you're actually creating a sport platform. It's a question.
Yeah, I think I know that there's some pieces in some of our countries right now, Great Britain, for example, where we have a lot of women who wouldn't be classifiable. They have disabilities that affect or impairments that affect their lower body, but they're not classifiable when it comes to para ice hockey. So if there was some flexibility within that classification system, Great Britain would have a team established right now. So yeah, it is a question to be discussed. I don't think fully able-bodied. I mean, we've seen what's happened in wheelchair basketball as of late, and unfortunately, yeah, it's. Anyways, I won't talk on that. But
you don't want to go down that path. Okay.
No, I don't want to go down that path. But I think, yeah, if we had potentially some flexibility in classification, we could have some women being able to classify and play who are already playing, who are already great para ice hockey players. Yeah.
Listen, we're really getting close to the end. I want to point out Dave has posted, so Jean's son has posted the blog that Jean had written years ago talking about the earliest forays from para ice hockey, sledge hockey here in Alberta. So thank you, Dave, for sharing that. Dr. Steadward, I want to make sure that I pass it over to you before we officially close. And we've only got 3 minutes before the end of our time here. I've really enjoyed this conversation today. And so Dr. Steadward, I pass it over to you for some final comments, some final thoughts.
Thank you very much, David. And first of all, can I extend, my sincerest appreciation to you, Annie, and Manny, and Tara, and Ted for bringing us up to date from the, as I like to say from time to time, from the womb to the tomb, where it started and where it is and where it's going for the future. This was a tremendous event today. This topic on sled hockey, sledge hockey, para ice hockey, or whatever we put the name to it. I guess because from IPC it's para ice hockey, but the changes that have taken place, the stories that are told, there's so much to share with so many other people. I mean, certainly people came on today to listen to what we have. We do have it archived, but I'm sure that there's hundreds of thousands of people around the world that don't have a clue where their sport started, how it grew, and where it's going in the future. And I was very, very so very excited to hear so much knowledge and experience and ideas passed on today. And you know, I go back myself, I guess after I experienced 76 and 80 and in Sweden and Norway with the Winter Games, they were, of course, primarily alpine and Nordic. And then it grew out of that to some of the ice sports. And it was great. And it's great to see how the para ice hockey has grown and developed. But I always remember too in Sweden or in Norway when there was ice picking going around that 400-meter track, which I thought was absolutely crazy. I said, there's hardly any of those kinds of tracks in the world today. And I tried to push it in IPC. By the time we were basically summer sports that grew out of ICC. So the poor lost cousins were sitting back there because they were basing themselves on sport, not disability. So there were some big changes to be made. And I always thought that short track speed skating or short track ice picking, because there are ice arenas in every town in the world. And so I hope people start looking at those things that are practical. But again, in those early days, a lot of the people that were participating in ice picking and sled hockey at the time were former wheelchair basketball players, former athletes from track and field. And either when they were finished or discouraged with their sport, they came into those. So I just think we have so many great stories. I mean, Manny, some of the things that you have done yourself because you have such a passion for their sport and what you have contributed. I think you underestimate the contribution that you've made towards the whole sport of para ice hockey. And I'd like to congratulate you and thank you for what you've done. And Tara, you know, what you have done for women, not only in this country, but globally, to help, again, have more women participate in Paralympic sports. It's great. Annie, to your twin sister who really moved this sport, certainly for all of us. We wouldn't be where we are today if it wasn't for your late sister who really developed this sport in North America particular. And Ted, you've always been a great historian, reminding us of dates, times, peoples, and places, which is always good. And the more I listen to these Steadward Talks, I mean, there should be 1,000 people or 2,000 people listening to this, because these are stories that can't find anywhere written down. We don't have them in our textbooks. We don't, and that's why I go back to my time with Hans Lindstrom after we've watched that recent movie that came out. We need to tell the real story, and what's really happened,
we do.
to our movement. But thank you, and congratulations to each and every one of you. This was a terrific presentation today, and I'm sorry to go on too far exceeding my time, David.
Not at all. Thank you very much to our guests who participated today. Again, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversations. We have gone 2 minutes over our official time. If I could, I'd love just to ask particularly our panelists, just to stay on for a few more minutes in case there are questions that want to get posted on the chat. To all of you, however, we're officially done, so you're certainly welcome to continue on with your day. Happy Wednesday. Thank you for attending. Our next Steadward Talk is going to be on December the 9th, where we look at the intersection of sport medicine and the Paralympic movement. We've already got 2 great speakers lined up. We're working on 2 others. We've Sherry Blauette, who's married to Eli Wolf, but that's, I don't think, necessarily her greatest accomplishment. And so a Paralympic world champion in her own right, and also a medical doctor. And then Chelsea Cattell, who's the chair of the IPC Athletes Council, a Paralympic athlete, and also a medical practitioner. And so that's going to be on December the 9th. And in late January, actually, we have IPC President Andrew Parsons lined up, who's going to spend an hour with us talking about, again, the history of the games and his intersection with that history. Thank you again. Happy Wednesday. And if I could just get our panelists to stay on just for a few more minutes in case there are questions that want to be addressed in the chat line, that would be great. It was a great session. Thank you so much.